Good.
Technology.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you all for coming out this morning. Today, the chairman of the special panel on P3 and the ranking member are here today to report on what they've put together over the past several months. In January, ranking member Ray Hall and I established the panel on public-private partnerships, and vice chair of the full committee, Chairman Duncan, chaired the panel. As I said, ranking member Capuano was his capable partner in this. Also, Chairman Duncan also chaired the freight panel, which last year came out with what I think are some good work to help us as we move forward. The P3 panel examined P3s across the jurisdiction of the T&I committee, all the modes, all the different subcommittees to try to, as they did, take a look to how do we improve our infrastructure with the public, the private sector bringing their dollars to bear. The panel and the staff have developed a good report and a set of recommendations, and I just want to thank the members of the panel. Do I have the members of the panel? Yeah, there they are. Chairman Duncan, Candace Miller from Michigan, Lou Barletta, Tom Rice, I guess there's Tom, Mark Meadows, and Scott Perry. On the Democrat side, ranking member Capuano, Peter DeFazio, Eleanor Holmes-Norton, Rick Larson, and Sean Maloney. Again, I want to thank each and every one of them for the good work they've done. And with that, I'll turn it over to Chairman Duncan to talk about the details. Chairman Duncan?
Well, thank you. Well, thank you very much, Chairman Schuster. And first of all, I want to say thank you to Chairman Schuster. It's been a real privilege to work under his leadership. He has put this committee back in the forefront of so many things and has returned it to its original bipartisan way of operation, and that's been very good. He asked me some time ago to chair two special panels last year, one on freight mobility, as he mentioned, and then this year on the growing use of public-private partnerships. And whether you like them or not, the use of public-private partnerships is really growing across the nation, and especially being used even more in other developed countries around the world. And so I think you're going to see a much greater use of public-private partnerships around the United States. And so we held two hearings and 7 policy roundtables and had countless meetings with interested parties. What we found was that public-private partnerships can provide benefits, especially in high-cost, technically complex projects. We heard examples of states and localities using partnerships to advance projects of national and regional significance. For example, Florida, for decades, has studied how to build a direct highway connection from Interstate 95 to the Port of Miami. Florida turned to the private sector to tap into the substantial worldwide experience in state-of-the-art tunnel boring technology, something Florida did not have. The $1 billion Port of Miami Tunnel project recently opened to traffic, finally declogging traffic in downtown, and that was because that was brought to fruition by a public-private partnership. Similarly, we heard a success story from Virginia where the state DOT had proposed to condemn over 300 homes and businesses and take very significant rights of way to widen the Capital Beltway in Northern Virginia. The private sector came in with an unsolicited bid that was significantly cheaper, used less right-of-way, and shifted construction and toll revenue risk to the private sector. The project opened on time and on budget, and because of the risk transfer agreement, if traffic volume and revenues are lower than expected, the private sector, not the state of Virginia, will be responsible. Another project of interest for the panel was the Eagle project in Denver. The Denver region is at the forefront of using public-private partnerships for the delivery of transit facilities. This was a $2.2 billion project involving the construction of 33 miles of new commuter rail track, which would have taken decades to complete if Denver had to rely on grant funds only. And this is a first in the U.S. that the private sector will operate one of the transit lines for the regional transit operator. Finally, the Port of Baltimore is one of the few examples of a port authority entering into a concessionaire agreement with the private sector. In 2010, Maryland entered into a 50-year agreement for the improvement, operations, and maintenance of one of the port's major terminals. This was a $1.3 billion project, included dredging a channel to a 50-foot depth to enable the port to serve post-Panamax cargo ships. And this project is another one that we heard was very successful and took over an operation that was losing and turned it totally, completely around. We've made recommendations to grow the public sector capacity to better structure these types of agreements in the future. We've made recommendations for breaking down barriers to public-private partnerships, and federal support is critical to these projects. And we've also made recommendations to ensure transparency and accountability. I could go into a little more detail, but we're very proud of our report, and I am especially proud of our members. We had 11 members on this panel, and all 11 participated very actively. We also found in our meetings that we had there is tremendous growing interest in public-private partnerships, especially when we went up to New York City and met with some of the top people on Wall Street. We found that they said they were just amazed at the number of calls they were receiving, people looking into companies wanting to get more into public-private partnerships. I'm not going to go on any further except to say that I especially appreciate the work of my ranking member, the co-chairman, I guess I always said of this panel, Michael Capiano. He's been a real pleasure and joy to work with on this project, and I would like to call on him at this time.
I think these odds are about right, 5-1. I feel comfortable. There we go. Come on over here, Tom. We got one. Come on, one more. When we started this, I think a lot of observers would never have suspected that we could come to a bipartisan agreement on this. I think some people, at least was talked to me, thought that we would just go down the typical partisan philosophical divide. And I am telling you, I didn't think that would happen with Jim Duncan at the head. Jimmy is, we do have our policy differences, but he's one of the best people I've met in Congress. You can work with them, you can talk with them, you can have thoughtful, reasonable agreements and disagreements. And again, this has been a continuation of a pleasure to serve with Jimmy Duncan and the other members as well, some of whom I knew, many of whom I did not. And I will tell you that this experience has been one of my best experiences in Congress. I went in personally with an open mind. I think a lot of people did, and I think as we went through, particularly when we shifted from the hearing process to the roundtable process, I think that became a lot more educational, a lot more interesting, and a lot more interactive for all of us. But I also want to sit here and talk about what P3 is all about. I adhere to pretty much everything that Jim just said, but I also have some caveats to the whole thing. People need to remember that there is no person who came to our panel who said that P3s could possibly take the place of federal investment. We need to put more money on the table to keep our infrastructure up to date and improving. That's a different issue for a different time, but not a single person came and said anything other than P3s are a specialized item that can handle a small percentage of the needs that we have. Doesn't mean they shouldn't be used, it just means they should not be seen as the panacea for our infrastructure need across the country. I think that a lot of people, including me, I want to be real clear, I think one of the reasons that P3 has become important and necessary is because so many of us in public life lack the political will to do what we think is necessary, not just on the federal level, but also on the state and local level. You can get a private entity to raise tolls quicker than you can get a public entity to do that. That's pretty well known. It's not a new model. In the past, it's usually been quasi-governmental agencies that have done that. We appoint turnpike authorities or port authorities, and what do? They raise fees so that they can actually make the business model work. I think that people need to understand that there is a lot of federal tax dollars on the table for each and every one of these P3 projects. There is none that are fully privately funded. We need TIFIA, we need PABs, we need traditional state and local funding. All of that is a huge chunk of every single P3. So that to think in any capacity that these are simply truly privately funded is just wrong. They are mostly publicly funded. And I repeatedly reminded people there are hidden tax benefits to many of these projects that need to be counted in public costs. That doesn't make them wrong. It just means that they are truly partnerships. It is not just private money that is lost when these things go bad. It is also public money. They do reduce the cost on a certain projects for the public exposure, and that's a good thing. But there is just no free lunch. There just isn't. If you want to build a port, you have to put public dollars on the table. You can get private dollars to match them, private dollars to make ends meet, and that is a good thing. But to pretend or imply that there's anything other than that is just wrong. And finally, I want to talk about accountability. I think one of the things we talked about is the lack of transparency on some of these. Just in the last couple of days, I'm sure that many of you have read the articles about the potential of the Indiana Toll Road going bankrupt. I don't know anything more than what's in the news reports. One of the reasons is we could not get information from that project. That was one of the projects we couldn't. Some of the projects were more open to us. Some of the projects were very open as far as giving us information. That one wasn't. And it makes you wonder, what are you hiding? We all live in a public world. Everything we do, good, bad, or indifferent, is very public. People have an opportunity to know who we are, what we do, how we raise campaign funds, what earmarks we used to get, no more, but someday. That's a different editorial for another time. But we live in a very public world. When tax dollars are on the line, either directly through traditional funding or indirectly through P3s, people deserve, in my opinion, and I think most people's opinion, deserve to know what's at stake, how the decisions were made, what is truly at risk, how much they can make, how much they can lose, and on and on and on. Why were those decisions made? And in this report, there are many of those proposals made. That's why it's a bipartisan report. And I want to go back to where I started. Many of you didn't think we could do this. We have done it because we've worked these things out, because the questions we're asking are not, we have a philosophical difference. It is, let's get this honestly. Good, bad, indifferent, with all the good, with all the warts. There is nothing in this world that is perfect, with the exception of my wife. And, you know, I'm on camera. I got to make sure I say that. Everything has good parts, everything has bad parts. I want to finish by also thanking the staff that does it. I mean, you all know how this place works. You know, we get up here and we do this, but staff does it. And I know the Republican staff has been great. I will tell you that, but I'll leave that to Jimmy. But the Democratic staff that I've worked with, the guys who kind of, well, I don't know if they make me look good, but they try to make me look good, and I try to blow it every opportunity, has been Ward McCarra, Jim Kolb, and Helena Ziblakevich. Now, Helena, I got as tough a name as you do, so you know, I think I did it already. And I also want to thank Steve Carlson on my own staff. He's been my translator on a lot of things. Some of these guys don't understand the Massachusetts accent, so somebody has to translate, and Steve's been a great asset to me, so I want to thank them. And I want to echo what Jimmy said. I had a great time with both the Democratic and Republican members of this committee. I enjoyed it. There wasn't 1 minute of difficult conversation. There were some minor disagreements. That's normal. And I will tell you that I also came to, which these things always do, especially these smaller groups. I actually think I've become friends with some of my Republican colleagues that I did not know before this committee. And that's a good thing, not just for this report, but it's a good thing going forward. So that's what I have to say, and thank you all for coming.
Well, Mike, thank you very much for those kind words, and you can tell from his remarks he certainly was a leader on this whole process. You also can see I liked hearings, he liked roundtables. We had 2 hearings and 7 roundtables. So
I don't win very often.
he talked about being in the minority. He had a lot of power in this process. I want to give the other members a chance to say something, and we'll start with my friend Candace Miller from Michigan.
Thanks very much, Judge. Appreciate that. I can't tell you how absolutely delighted I am to be here today and to be able to present as a active participant in this fantastic panel, working committee, really, this report that you're all looking at here. And the first thing I would say is thanks to Chairman Schuster, who really has had the vision for, as we are in the process now of this 5-year reauthorization, how we can all try to think creatively and use ingenuity really to think about how we can do various kinds of things to do infrastructure investment, because there isn't a country, or certainly a state in our country, that has enough coins in their blue jeans to be able to afford all of the infrastructure investment that they need. And really, economically, throughout history, the economics has always followed the transportation grid. If you think about our country, with the wagon trains going out west initially, and then the rail spurs going out, and then the interstates coming. Certainly, shipping has always been a critical component, and the aviation links as well. And so every state is struggling with how they can afford to do the infrastructure investments that they need. And this concept of P3s, public-private partnerships, which has been utilized so very effectively in a number of other countries, and now even in our country as well, but not in every state, is something that we would like to be able to not mandate, but incentivize to the states to be able to utilize other kinds of, as I say, creative financing to be able to invest in their infrastructure. And I think that is it will be a very important component. I talk about it in my state all the time about the reauthorization. I come from Michigan. I'm the only member on TNI from Michigan, and I'll just give you one quick example, because both Jimmy and Mr. Capiano went through all of these various kinds of initiatives. You just think about roads that could be applicable under P3s, but really it's everything. In my district, we have the second, it's something called the Blue Water Bridge, which is the second busiest border crossing on the northern tier of our nation. And for 13, 14 years, we've been sort of dinking around with Customs and Border Protection and our Department of Transportation, Federal Highways, et cetera, to do a customs plaza there, because we sometimes have hours of line up there. And of course, we're the automotive state. You can imagine what this means economically to our industry and just to people transiting. So I've talked to our governor about actually having this as a pilot program. This has been widely reported on in Michigan, so I'm not speaking out of turn here, because you have there's an authority there, so there's a dedicated revenue stream. You could have the Michigan Department of Transportation, you can have the Federal Highways, you can have the Customs and Border Protection, you can have the GSA because they're a leasee, et cetera. It's just one example, but whether you're doing something for bridges or roads or ports or whatever, P3s is an idea whose time certainly has come, and I think you're going to really see this thing take off. And again, the impetus is coming from the Transportation Infrastructure Committee here in the House. So my pleasure to serve with all of these men and women on this working committee. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Candace. And we were very fortunate to have as our the most senior member of our panel is my friend Peter DeFazio from Oregon. I'd like to have him have a few comments at this time.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. It was a pleasure, and it was, I think, very informative, and I think there's an excellent report which we're putting forward. I think, to me, of all the roundtables and hearings, one of the key moments was when we had a group that was principally financial services people and others who have a vested interest in P3s from a perspective other than the building of infrastructure. And I said to them, the magnitude of the problem confronting the country. I won't repeat any of it here, but we do have a phenomenal deficit in infrastructure, both in bringing the existing infrastructure up to a state of good repair and in building 21st century infrastructure. And I said, so given that, given all the tools we've talked about here, Mike talked about a number of these things, TIFIA, the P3s, the role TIFIA plays in T3s, PABs, all the tools, all the tax advantages and everything. I said, if we got that to an optimal point, what part of America's infrastructure problem could P3s solve? And basically the answer was 10 to 12%. And the conclusion from that panel, which had a vested interest in putting forward a much higher number, but I thought was a realistic number, was we are still going to need a very significant and robust federal investment to solve these problems, and that's the conclusion the report comes to. It's a tool. P3s are a tool. We've come a long way. Mike mentioned the Indiana Turnpike. That was essentially that wasn't a greenfield project. That was taking an existing asset and selling it, and it was rife with problems. I held hearings on that a number of years ago, it's not surprising there are some problems there, but greenfields are the real focus for these P3s. Sharing of risk, something that came out to a great extent, and appropriately pricing risk, which is somewhat problematic. So there's a lot of nuances and details. I think this report can provide guidance to the committee as we go into reauthorization next year and look at how we're going to enhance the tools for P3s where appropriate, how we're going to provide protections and guidance. The Department of Transportation's come a long way. They have some pretty darn good guidance online now for the states. They learned from some of the early mistakes that went on with P3s. So I think this was a very, very constructive process in the best traditions of this committee. There's nothing partisan. There should be nothing partisan about infrastructure. And, I think when you look at WARDA, you look at the proposed Amtrak reauthorization, you look at this report, this committee is living up to that tradition. So I thank our two leaders, one of whom is pretty darn partisan, but he's still, we didn't need to be here. So thanks very much. Appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much, Peter. And I think one thing we had bipartisan agreement on from the start, we didn't want any of these to provide money to some governor or mayor all on the front end and then leave taxpayers holding the bag 25 or 30 or 50 years down the road. And so we were careful to ask questions about that as well. But the next speaker, Congressman Barletta, is a former mayor of Hazleton, Pennsylvania, and was from the start, had great interest in the proceedings of this panel, and we were fortunate to have him. I'd like to call on Lou at this time.
Thank you, Chairman. My time as mayor, I've utilized P3s as a way to help revitalize our city. I found it to be another way that we can get the private sector involved to get capital projects going with the help. When the private sector's money is on the table, that project has a better chance to succeed than when it's just government money totally at the table. So I was able to use that very successfully back home. And as Mayor Capuano talked about, it's not the answer to our problems. It's a tool in our box, a tool that we can use moving forward to get a long-term transportation bill. I chair the Economic Development, Public Buildings, and Emergency Management Subcommittee on T&I. And public buildings are different from other types of infrastructure. With roads and bridges, for example, the discussion has been on whether to leverage private capital to build or maintain them. With public buildings, private sector capital is already an integral part of the providing federal space. The weather question has already been answered with public buildings. However, and that's what I found very important with this panel and the report, is the biggest roadblock that I've run into is that OMB scores most public-private partnerships as capital leases instead of operating leases. In other words, we have to have the upfront cash on hand for the whole project before signing the agreement instead of benefiting from spending the cost over 20 or 30 years. And I've been arguing to change the scoring rules for real estate so that we can use P3s to move large projects that have been put on hold. And this P3 panel includes a very important recommendation to change the way real estate is handled over current budgetary scoring rules. So there are recommendations that I believe are very important to how we proceed moving forward. Again, I want to thank all my colleagues for their work on this report and the many private sector participants who helped raise the profile of this very important issue. And I look forward to seeing taxpayer dollars better leveraged in these innovative P3 agreements. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lou. And next, we have my friend Tom Rice from South Carolina, tax lawyer, and sure kept up with the financing on all these projects in a big way and was a very active participant. I'd like to have Congressman Rice.
Well, thank you, Chairman Duncan and Ranking Member Capuano. I really enjoyed participating in this subcommittee and learned a lot. And what I learned was that P3s are not a panacea. They're just a tool. They're a great way to lever taxpayer dollars. We need every tool we can in this time of tight budgets. They've been used in my state successfully and unsuccessfully, but they're just another arrow in the quiver, and we need to be exploring every possible avenue we have. So thank you for being here, and enjoyed participating on the committee.
Okay, and we usually save the best for last. We've got got our newest member on our panel was Mark Meadows from North Carolina. Once again, a very, very active leader on this panel and participant. So, Mark.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so much. Thank you for your leadership. This report that you have is really just a foundation, but I want to give you some good news. Shortly into this panel, we were able to get rid of the translator so I could start to understand what Mike was saying.
He didn't change his mind.
Actually, Mike said this earlier. What it provided was a real foundation in a bipartisan way for us to not only deal with P3s, but with other issues. And this report is not the end product. It's the beginning. And I think that that's the challenge for each one of us. How do we use this tool to make sure that the infrastructure that our country needs moving forward is not only well-financed, but provides the modern infrastructure that we need to compete globally. I can tell you, talking to Madame Fu from China, she said that if we don't build it, another country will. And it is critical that we make sure that we're competitive. And it's been an honor and a privilege to serve with these fellow panel members. Truly, their wisdom was something that I was able to take home on a regular basis. And so thank you, Chairman, for your leadership and your vision.
Okay, well, all these other members have so many duties, that so I'm going to let them slip on out, and Mike and I will stay here to answer any questions that you might have. I do want you to notice one thing, that the first page of the report has all the staff listed. The members are listed on the last page, so which is very, very appropriate, I think. But I do want to thank my Irish team, Claire Doherty and David Connolly, who really, from my standpoint, did most of the work on this, and Don Walker, who many of you know, who's been with me for over 20 years now. Don usually can tell you right down to the months and days and hours that he's been with me too. So, but I appreciate Don. I'll just add, you've got the report, and I think the staff's done an outstanding job. All the staff that have worked on it. Chairman Schuster has, as I mentioned, wants us to try to incorporate as much as possible on public-private partnerships in the legislation that we're going to get into in the next Congress, particularly the highway bill and other things. And of course, the Department of Transportation has had someone involved in this whole process right from the start, and so we're working with them as well too. But anything else you want to add? All right. So if any of you have any questions, we'll try to answer them. And the staff is available too. Yes. Well, I hope we can. That'll be primarily determined in the next Congress. But as Mike and I agree, and I think all of us agree, that we want to use all those tools as they have been described. And so I do think. Peter mentioned that some people said that public-private partnerships are 10 to 12% of the basket that we work with, but I think I will be very surprised if they're not a much bigger percentage 10 and 20 years down the road. But certainly I've been very supportive of TIFIA and public activity bonds and private activity bonds and all these things. And I agree with them on the earmarks too. So I think that was one of the biggest mistakes that we ever made. We didn't save any money. We just put more power in the bureaucracy. Anything you want to add?
I agree, but I think people need to be warned that in the one significant tax package that was proposed this year, the repeal of PABs was proposed, so that there are those who disagree with us. It will be a significant debate going forward. And TIFIA, the expansion of TIFIA is really not, I don't think there's a significant difference on that, but the question is whether we'll be expanding the concept to other types of infrastructure and other items. And you probably cannot do it all overnight.
Next year, Ways and Means is working on tax reform, and they take that idea like the one you just mentioned about, well, eliminate private equity bonds, right? That was in Chairman Camp's
proposal.
Isn't that going to make your life difficult if you're working a highway bill and the Ways and Means?
Different people can see different things, and we will have that debate when the time comes. And we'll see where it goes. It's a reasonable debate to have. This is not a deep philosophical thing. This is not an emotion anymore, because this is financing. It's the kind of thing that I think you can have a thoughtful, nonpartisan debate about, and we'll have it when the time comes.
Well, Chairman, I have great respect for Chairman Camp. He's a good friend of mine, but he had some things in his proposals that are not going to come about, and I think he'd have a difficult time doing away with the private activity bonds. That's it.
Let's do one more question.
All right. All right, well, if any of you have any questions you want to talk to us about or anything else, just let us know. But thank you very much for coming today. Thank you.